Welcome everyone. Thank you. It's wonderful to see so many people here. My colleague Tracy Dennis and I are going to spend the next hour trying to give you some perspective on some of the rules and regulations that apply to working within the broader public sector. So we're here as representatives of COPA, as Scott said, which is a shared services organization that provides support to Peterborough Regional amongst other hospitals in the sort of central Ontario region, as our name suggests, around strategic sourcing, procurement, and other aspects of supply chain. So with us today, we have a number of representatives from Peterborough Regional. We have Ken Tremblay, CEO. We have Steve McDonald and Leslie Highway from the foundation. And in the back row, we have Shane Paquette and Janet Minich from supply chain / procurement. So if you have questions, we may call on them to help answer some of them. So Tracy is the Director of Strategic Sourcing at COPA, and she does manage a lot of the procurement activity her team does that's done on behalf of Peterborough Regional. So what we're going to do today, now I'll just move up here and grab my clicker. What we're going to do today is, first of all, just give you a bit of perspective on who we are, meaning both Peterborough and COPA, and what we do, how we support procurement activities. I want to give you a little bit of information about the broader public sector procurement directive, which is the government legislation that prescribes how we do our procurements. Tracy's going to talk a bit then about competitive procurement and what the processes typically are. And we will give you some do's and don'ts, as Scott said. What's really helpful for you when you want to respond to a request for proposal or look for business. And just then there's also a slide on where to look for information. So you have everything in your package. You actually have two documents. You have a copy of the presentation itself, so you can make notes, and also there's some slides in here that we won't be going over in painstaking detail, but they're here for you as reference. And you also have a document that we downloaded from the internet called Doing Business with the Ontario Broader Public Sector, that the government put out at about the same time the procurement directive came into being, to help organizations understand what the rules and regulations are. You'll find that there's an awful lot in here that is similar to what we'll cover today. Because we have limited time, we're going to ask you to hold your questions to the end, unless you have a question for clarification, in which case, of course, we'll be pleased to stop and go over it. Okay, so organizationally, I've already told you a little bit about COPA. This today is not about COPA, so I just wanted to put it in context for you. These are the 6 equity member hospitals of COPA, so they own COPA, and so as I mentioned at the beginning, Peterborough is one of those. And we also support 5 customer hospitals, some of whom are in this general geographic vicinity, so you may also do work with them. But typically for the customer hospitals, they join us for some of the requests for proposal that we do, but most of the work that COPA does is on behalf of the 6 equity member hospitals. And the one other piece I'll just share with you about shared services organizations is there are now 9 of them in Toronto, 9 of them in Ontario. All hospitals in Ontario are not affiliated with shared services organizations, but somewhere in the range of 85% of patient beds are now participating in one form or another with a shared services organization. And they have been formed over the past 10 or 12 years to try to provide value for money for the organizations they support, to drive efficiencies and to do things more efficiently so that we can take non-value added cost out of the system. And then we play a big role, and this is a lot of what we're going to talk about today, we play a big role in terms of compliance and risk mitigation. So ensuring, in fact, that the hospitals that we support are in compliance with the procurement directive directive, and so that the hospital's reporting will be accurate and up to date. So there's always confusion about who does what in terms of procurement with a shared services organization. And for COPA, it's pretty consistent across our member hospitals. So in the top half of the slide, you see all of the different products and services that would be managed by COPA from a procurement point of view. So if we're going to do an RFP, whether it's for Peterborough by itself or on behalf of all 6 member hospitals, we would lead the charge for any of the products or services in the top half. For Peterborough, though, if you are here because you're interested in either food or pharmacy, capital redevelopment, or professional services, then Peterborough would actually initiate the work to do that procurement activity and issue any RFPs. And I did mention earlier that Janet and Shane were here, so we've just actually provided their contact information for you as well in the event that you do need to talk to them about something that's in their grouping. So the next piece is just to talk a little bit about the context for how we arrived at the broader public sector procurement directive specifically, which does govern how we do manage all of our procurement activities now. So for a number of years, the healthcare sector in general has been challenged to operate more efficiently, and as I referenced earlier, to look for ways to take non-value added cost out of the system. And in particular, there have been a lot of challenges over the past few years that have led to more scrutiny around accountability and whether organizations are operating in a fair, open, and transparent manner. So in 2010, the Government of Ontario passed the Broader Public Sector Accountability Act, and in that act, it provided the opening for the Management Board of Cabinet to issue directives around both procurement and expenses, and they both came to pass. There's an expenses directive that governs how we all manage our expenses, and then the procurement directive that manages how we, or governs how we manage our procurement activities. Both of them have the force of legislation because they were contemplated in the Act. So when somebody says to you, we have to do it this way because this is what it says in the procurement directive, they're saying that because, in fact, it is, to put it in its simplest terms, the law. Because legislation says that all broader public sector organizations must comply with the 25 mandatory requirements that are in the procurement directive. And broader public sector has grown over the years to encompass any public sector organization that receives a certain amount of funding from the Ontario government, but at its core, it's healthcare organizations and educational institutions. So school boards, colleges, and universities. We all fall under the Act and the procurement directive. So one of the things that the Broader Public Sector Accountability Act itself said was that hospital presidents and CEOs and their boards of directors had to prepare annual attestations with respect to compliance with the requirements of the BPSAA. And there's 2 specific things they report on every year. One is how they have secured consultants and that they have followed the correct processes in terms of how they've secured consultants, because that was a major catalyst for the creation of the BPSAA in the first place. And secondly, they have to attest that they have been compliant with the procurement directive. So every year we give Ken and his team a report that demonstrates the extent to which all the procurements that were done on behalf of Peterborough were compliant with the procurement directive, so he can report on that. So the procurement directive, and these are the next couple of slides, are the ones that I'm not going to be going through in detail. They're here for your reference. The procurement directive is absolutely founded in and aligns with the Agreement on Internal Trade. And the Agreement on Internal Trade is an intergovernmental agreement, take that to mean interprovincial agreement, that governs how trade happens throughout Canada. And the core principles of the Agreement on Internal Trade is that all trade must be fair, open, and transparent. So the good news about that is that it means that anyone who's going out to do a procurement, especially if it's over $100,000, and we'll talk about the thresholds in a couple of minutes, if it's over $100,000, then the procurement must be made available to anyone who wants to bid on it, unless there are very compelling reasons for non-competitive procurement, and Tracy's going to go over that. I guess what you could call the bad news about that is it means that an organization like Peterborough Regional can't say, well, I'm only going to buy locally, because if we look further at the guiding principles of the Agreement on Internal Trade, you'll see that there is, one of the principles is non-discrimination. And non-discrimination essentially ties to the fact that you can't discriminate in terms of how you decide where to buy your goods and services. And there are a number of practices that are listed which are not allowed under the Agreement on Internal Trade, and I have given you a snapshot of those. This is not all of them, but it's ones that might relate specifically to the types of procurements that an organization like Peterborough Regional would undertake. And again, if you read the first one, it prohibits registration requirements and restrictions, I might as well use their language, on calls for bids based upon the location of a supplier and its subcontractors. So it's really pretty clear. Now, and again, as Tracy's going to talk about in a few minutes, there are different thresholds, and these practices really align to procurements that are over $100,000, but the balance of the practices that are in the procurement directive apply no matter what the value of the procurement. So, not surprisingly, when you look at the leading practice principles of the procurement directive itself, you will see their accountability and transparency, two key themes, also of course value for money, quality service delivery, and process standardization. So those are the major drivers of what organizations are trying to do now as they comply with the procurement directive, whether directly as a healthcare organization or on behalf of those organizations. So every broader public sector organization in Ontario has to have established their own procurement policies and procedures, and they must be compliant with the procurement directive. So for Peterborough Regional, they have their own set internally, and then when COPA does a procurement on behalf of Peterborough Regional, we follow Peterborough's policies and procedures because we are procuring on their behalf. And most of the policies and procedures across our member hospitals are consistent, so we don't often get into a conflict there because it's pretty straightforward what we have to do based on what's outlined in the directive. We also all have a supply chain code of ethics that governs the way we go about our supply chain in general, but our procurements in particular. So if you've participated in RFPs to date, you will probably have been asked to sign a non-disclosure as part of the process, and for certain you would have been asked to make a conflict of interest statement. And I'm just going to spend a minute on conflict of interest because it is a really key principle here. And so the procurement directive is very clear that anyone who's involved in a procurement must declare whether or not they have a conflict. And that applies to on the inside and on the outside. So within an organization, any employees or advisors, or if we hire external consultants, they all would have to declare conflicts if they existed. Likewise, when we put out the RFP, we ask suppliers to declare any real or perceived conflicts. And there are a lot of different criteria that can mean that there is a real or perceived conflict. I think some of them are pretty obvious, and that's, if there are direct relationships that could compromise your objectivity and that sort of thing. But one of the ones that I always like to highlight, because I think people really aren't aware of this, especially in the supplier community, is the one on the bottom, which says that if you provide consulting advice to an organization that is developing specifications for an RFP, you may not respond to that RFP. So as a piece of advice, I would say if you are asked for advice, or if you would like to provide advice, you need to think carefully about whether you want to be engaged to provide that advice, or if you would prefer not to, so that you can in fact respond to the subsequent RFP. I also just want to highlight, because the foundation is a big part of this, that while the foundation itself doesn't engage in procurement, they technically follow the same procurement process as the hospital. And by that, what I mean is that any procurements that are done on behalf of the foundation also must be compliant with the procurement directive and be based on the same competitive thresholds that we're gonna look at. And I think it's just also important to state that a donation cannot influence the outcome of an RFP, nor can it be considered part of the evaluation criteria. So when we look at the criteria that we establish, in days gone by, you might actually have seen a request right in an RFP for a donation to the foundation. And now all BPS organizations are very careful to ensure that an arm's length relationship exists with their foundations, and that there is no, because that could be considered to be a conflict. This is the list of the 25 mandatory requirements. We do training sessions where we go through them one by one, and that takes all day, so we're not going to do that today. But this, it gives you an appreciation for the fact that the mandatory requirements start right up at the beginning in terms of approval authorities, and works through the procurement thresholds, which Tracy will cover, the principles of competitive procurement, how the purchasing is done. Lots of time is spent in the procurement directive on evaluation and contract award to ensure that it is done fairly and without bias. There's some pretty clear language around non-competitive procurement, which Tracy will cover. And then they have a real emphasis on document retention and contract management to ensure that we have good records of everything that took place, and also to ensure that we, from the point of view of contract management, that on a go-forward basis, everything is being managed in a timely way. We touched on conflict of interest, and of course, there is always an opportunity in any RFP for a vendor to ask for a debriefing, with the hope that that process will prevent us from ever getting to a situation of a bid dispute. But there was always language in an RFP that deals with the potential for a bid dispute. At the beginning, I mentioned that a big part of what we do as an organization is around risk mitigation. And these are some of the principles that all procurement initiatives would follow, whether they're managed by COPA or directly by Peterborough Regional. So as we've said, they have to meet the requirements of the Agreement on Internal Trade and be compliant with the Procurement Directive. They have to align with the organization's own code of ethics, policies, and procedures. They have to be open, fair, and transparent, depending on the threshold again, because some may be invitational, but if they are over $100,000, then they must meet those criteria. And in fact, even if when they're under 100,000, for sure, they have to be fair and transparent. They must focus on delivering the specified requirements, so that relates to asking for what you want and being sure you know what you want, so that we give you good information to use in your response. Obviously, we're looking to generate competition, and we work very hard to minimize the use of non-competitive procurement. And we have a lot of good processes in place to try to prevent that. So I'll just stop for a minute and ask if there are any questions that specifically relate to the background before I hand it over to Tracy to talk a bit more about competitive procurement.
What are the penalties for being non-compliant with the procurement directive for a hospital or an organization?
Ken, would you like to speak to that?
I'm convinced they're going to repurpose Kingston Penitentiary for wayward executives. They allow penalties, they allow for other proceedings, and that's why when we sign with attestations, we have to do our due diligence, because at the end of the day, board chair and I are liable for any breach of that, which is the same for the colleges and the universities. The whole shared service enterprise supply chain was actually underwritten by the Minister of Finance about a decade ago, because what they really wanted was a broader public sector in the wake of e-health, in the wake of Orange, and a few other things that were going on. They saw this as a real political liability, cronyism, favors, envelopes in dark alleys, all those kinds of Hollywood things. So they're pretty serious about this.
Yeah.
This is maybe a little deep for the session, but I'm struggling with the pre-qualification that's listed up there. It seems like that's inevitably going to be a barrier to some people's access to a price a job if you have a pre-qualification process.
So can you say more about pre-qualification?
Pre-qualification, as I understand it, is a situation where you establish a threshold or a group of people that you want to have to price it. You might say 10 bidders, and then you presumably pick the 10 best, but it provides a barrier to everyone else, it seems to me. And it's almost a circular logic piece inside there where you're now providing barriers.
Okay, so that is a whole session in itself to talk about the request for supplier qualification process. But so I see, because it's in one of the 25 mandatories, it is an established process that allows you to determine how many suppliers in the space can actually meet your needs, and then you use them sorry, I don't have the mic on anymore, but then you use them on a circular basis, not in a positive way, in terms of rotating around the suppliers over time to ensure that they all get some of the business. The intent is to say that we're going to find either an infinite number of suppliers who can meet the need, or we're going to establish it at 10, but if you set criteria that you have an equal opportunity to respond to and to meet in the pre-qualification process. So it actually is very much predicated on the principles of being fair and open, because everybody has an opportunity to meet those criteria through the pre-qualification process. So if you'd like to talk about that some more after, we can certainly stay around and do that, but I think because that could take a while.
Okay, thank you.
Others? Okay, so over to Tracy.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to come to Peterborough, as always. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the competitive procurement, the thresholds, some of the processes in a little bit more detail. I'm the Director of Strategic Sourcing at COPA, and I have a team of specialists who manage their own portfolios that cover some of the areas that Sarah's already gone over that are in scope for COPA. So I didn't bring my glasses. I didn't think I'd be this far away from the screen, but I can see it okay. So one of the mandatory requirements for the Procurement Directive is that each organisation establishes an approval authority schedule. This schedule identifies who within that organisation can approve different levels of acquisitions or value of procurements. And that AAS document has to be approved by the Board of Directors. Prior to any commencement of any type of procurement or acquisition, that has to be approved according to the AAS. And if there's any non-competitive procurement going to be taking place, then that has to be one level higher than the normal approval levels. So it's just to demonstrate to you that there are steps within an organisation where procurement has to be approved, and depending on the value, the higher it goes. I put this slide in because there is an emphasis on consulting services. Sarah's mentioned it before. You'll notice from this example that consulting services have to be approved by the President or the CEO if it goes through a non-competitive process. So the Ministry takes this very seriously, the procurement of consulting services. The procurement thresholds that Peterborough have, specifically, each hospital will have a slightly different thresholds and the processes that align to those thresholds. The only threshold that the BPS Procurement Directive does mandate is the $100,000 over and above the procurement value has to go through an open competitive process. And I'll explain how we get to that $100,000 in the next couple of slides. But for Peterborough specifically, if they're purchasing something that's worth less than $5,000, then they can go through what we call an informal procurement process. What they will require a minimum of one quotation, and all these processes are a minimum. Between the $5,000 and the $100,000 threshold, then there's a variety, depending on the type of acquisition, the type of procurement, how complex or not complex it is. They can either choose to do an informal 3 quotation, invite on a more formal basis, the minimum of 3 bids, or go to open competition. This slide goes into a little bit more detail as to what each of those processes look like. Informally, as I explained, it's under the $5,000 threshold, but cannot be used for consulting services. The informal quotation up to $100,000 applies to the goods and services. They again cannot be applied to consulting services. Invitational competition can apply to consulting services, and that's actually the minimum requirement, or the lowest possible process in terms of procurement and acquisition. And then the open competitive process, as I said before, is the only one that the BPS Procurement Directive does actually stipulate. So how we calculate the total procurement value, it's simply not the cost of what the hospital would spend on that particular consumable or service within a fiscal year. I'll take an example in the middle there. If the hospital is spending $5,000 a month on a particular service, a non-consulting service, and the base term of a contract would be a minimum of 3 years, then the option years we have to take into account as well. So we have to calculate the value over a 4-year period, and that easily gets over the $100,000 threshold. So that means the hospital and or COPA, if we're working on their behalf, have to go out to open competitive process. Just a little bit on the non-competitive procurement. So organisations can do this because there are unique circumstances where there will only be one supplier available to provide the goods and services. We cannot do it purposely to avoid competition between suppliers or to discriminate in any way. So we have to determine whether or not it's a single or sole source as per the Agreement on Internal Trade, which Sarah has mentioned before. We have to document the rationale around that decision and secure the appropriate approval according to the approval schedule that I mentioned before. So we strongly encourage organisations not to go the non-competitive route unless it is truly an exception and it is very well documented. It's one of the things that we report back to the hospitals on for their attestation. And just a reminder there to everybody that Peterborough's non-competitive procurement process aligns to these principles, which is part of the Procurement Directive. So these are some examples. There are about 6 or 7 different examples under sole sourcing and then 7 or 8 under single sourcing with the agreement on internal trade. So sole sourcing is where there is only one available supplier of a good or service. You've got no choice. It's like having a monopoly type marketplace. So, and this is one of the exception codes that we're allowed to apply. And it's where we will have to ensure compatibility with existing products, recognize exclusive rights, exclusive licensing, usually things like proprietary software limits competition in that particular area. And single sourcing is where there may be other suppliers available to provide that service, but because of the specific circumstance, there's only one supplier capable of delivering the goods and services. And one of the codes which is allowed under the AIT is where there is an unforeseeable situation of urgency that exists. So if there had to be an urgent repair to part of the hospital, a wall had fallen down or a patient was at risk, then that would create a situation of urgency where some remedial work would have to be done and non-competitive procurement would be justified for that occasion. However, it's important to note that failure to plan doesn't constitute a situation of urgency. So organisations are expected to plan for their sourcing and to go out to open competition. If you want to look up the Agreement on Internal Trade, they'll list all the other different exceptions there. Another part of the AIT is non-application, so where the non-competitive and the competitive procurement doesn't apply. So this, again, these are a few examples where we would contract with a public body or a non-profit making organisation. Donations is another example. If we were to have a contract from prison labour or persons with disabilities, then again that would be not applicable. There's a list of licensed professionals, so we could have contracts with medical doctors and dentists and nurses. Again, it wouldn't apply. The rules and regulations wouldn't apply to those types of services. And health services and social services are also included in there. This is a slide that demonstrates the procurement workflow that each request for proposal goes through. And again, this would be a workflow that COPA does on behalf of Peterborough, or if Peterborough are doing out of scope RFPs, then they would follow a very similar workflow. So I'm going to have to get a little bit closer now. I'll turn my head. So I'll just walk through the main steps. Each of these steps involves a lot of different processes, and some of them are more complex than others. But the first step is to identify the purchase requirements and secure the approval. Very important, which I've already explained. And that's the start of our blackout period. I've got a slide on that, so I'll talk to that in a few minutes. So once the hospital or group of hospitals, because COPA does regional RFPs, so we may do a single RFP for Peterborough, but more often than not it involves more than one hospital. So we have 6 member hospitals and 5 customer hospitals. We could be going to the marketplace for 11 organisations over our region. So once we've got the approval, we need to develop the specifications that will go into that RFP document. And then the RFP document is actually issued. So it's posted on an open public tender site. And I've got a slide at the end which will tell you where to go if you want access to those sites. And that means that any vendor, it's the internet. So any supplier globally can have access to that opportunity and bid for that opportunity. So we post that document. It's out there for a minimum of 15 days. A lot of complex RFPs are out for much longer to allow you time to build your response, build your proposal, ask questions in the interim through the open tendering site. That's managed by the bid administrator. So if you need any clarifications on an RFP document, that's the time to do it. And then all those questions are gathered by the specialist and shared with, again, through the open tendering site, so everybody has access to all the questions and all the answers.
Excuse me,
Yes,
is there a site that you can go on to see these RFPs?
there is, and it's on one of the slides. We've included that for you. So once the RFP closes, we receive all the bids from the suppliers. At COPA, the specialists do the mandatory requirements checks, and then we send those proposals out to the evaluation team that have been nominated by the participating hospitals. We would then gather those scores from those evaluators and award the business to the highest ranked supplier. Now, it's more than just a paper exercise. There's financial and non-financial criteria. There's sometimes demonstrations and trials of equipment involved in there. There's usually presentations by some of the suppliers. There may be a shortlisting methodology in there as well. All that information will be contained within the RFP document. So it's transparent as to what the process we're going to be going through in order to evaluate the proposals. So once we've identified the highest ranked vendor or vendors, because it's not always a single vendor award, then we would finalize a contract or an agreement with that vendor. After that, we will then notify the unsuccessful vendors and post openly, again, a contract award notice on the same site where you've pulled down the RFP opportunity. At that point, you have 60 days to apply for a vendor debriefing, and we would encourage you to do so. It's a great opportunity, if you have been unsuccessful, to learn where you were weak and strong compared to some of the highest ranked vendor, and where you can improve your bid next time round.
Is that usually a face-to-face meeting or a telephone meeting?
It could be either. We prefer face-to-face, but sometimes the logistics mean it would be over the phone. And that would be with the strategic sourcing specialist and usually the evaluation team lead from the participating hospital. And then we would manage the contract throughout the term, throughout its cycle. It could be a 3-year contract, may have options to extend. It could be a 5-year contract, so we have to manage those different expiries and notifications. And governing that whole process is we do have an ethical framework. We do have procurement policies and procedures, and we use checklists and templates which are used broadly across the BPS, broader public sector.
Tracy, can I just add something as
Yes.
well? Tracy's really focused walking through this, for example, on using the open competitive process, but this entire workflow also pertains to an invitational competitive process. We have to follow all the same rules. So it's only in the informal processes where there is some relaxation of the directive, although we still need to be compliant with the regulations as they're set out. But this, although it would be simpler, it does also apply to invitational RFPs.
And processes lower than the $100,000 threshold.
Correct.
Yeah. Thank you. So the blackout period, I thought this is important because sometimes this is where suppliers incumbent suppliers feel that some of the interaction can be restrained. That's not the case when it comes to the day-to-day contracts that you already have with the organisation. So for COPA, our blackout period, as I explained, starts at the very beginning of the process and goes right through to the contract award when we post the award notice. During that period, communications should only be via the bid administrator, which will be, or the RFP coordinator, which will be the strategic sourcing specialist at either COPA, or if Peterborough are doing their own, then their own strategic sourcing specialist. I mentioned questions and answers during the RFP posting period. That's all communicated through the RFP coordinator, so there should be no direct communication from yourselves to an organisation participating in the RFP or to anybody else within COPA. It has to go through a formal communication channel. As I said before, if you are the incumbent and you're delivering a contract for a service, then it's business as usual for that contract. What you must not do is discuss anything to do with the future business and the RFP. And we also suggest that employees that are involved in the RFP process do not attend any sponsored events by yourself. So please don't approach anybody that's involved in an RFP process at a hospital or COPA with a golf day when it's bang in the middle of the RFP process. So it does happen, and we have to decline. Some RFP do's and don'ts, and some of these are mentioned in the guide that we handed out to you earlier. So, and hopefully we've tried to give you some of this information today about knowing your market. So understand, in this particular case, Peterborough and COPA and how we operate, what we mean by an open competitive process and an invitational competitive process. I should explain, invitational means that we will actually invite you. So we may do that through the same site, but we will only invite a minimum of 3 for that particular opportunity. As I said before, if it's over the $100,000 threshold, then it's open to everybody. So know the rules and requirements, and hopefully we've given you an overview of that and given you information to go back and do some more research if you so wish. Follow the instructions in the RFP. It sounds simple, but it's really important that you pay attention particularly to the evaluation criteria. The evaluation criteria and methodology will include weightings, so you'll know which part of the evaluation criteria is weighted higher than other parts. So, for instance, pricing may be weighted at 30%, and your technical and functional requirements may be rated 60%, and then you could get another 10% for agreeing to the form of agreement. So it does vary, and that will help you build your proposal. Please respond to all the mandatory requirements. If you don't, that will be disqualification. So they usually cover things like making sure you've completed all the documentation we've asked for, submitted certificates if we've asked for certificates, and licenses. And obviously read the fine print. And we've also included a site address for you to go and take a look at some of the templates for the forms of agreements and the RFPs as well, so you can do some background work. Please get your submission in on time. Again, if it's late, we will return it. So you will not, even if you're a minute late, we will not open it and it will not be considered. Sarah mentioned earlier on about helping to develop specifications. Decline to do that. This is seen as a conflict of interest. And I mentioned before, ask for a debriefing when you are the unsuccessful proponent, because you can get some valuable information from that. in order to improve your proposal next time. Not necessarily to Peterborough or COPA, but to any broader public sector, or even provincial-wide OPS. Any public sector organisation, we work to very similar rules and regulations, and it will give you valuable information. So these are a few of the links that we've provided for you to go to. So Bidding Go and Mercs. COPA uses Bidding Go primarily. Peterborough, do you use both? Bidding Go primarily. Mercs is used by the ministry, the Ontario Public Service primarily. And that site is actually going to be changing, I believe, later on this year. They've got a new provider for that site, so that'll be changing slightly. Yes?
Is that buyandsell.ca? Because I was informed last summer that they were going from Mercs to buyandsell.ca. Does that sound familiar?
That name doesn't sound familiar.
Not specifically. So I think you'll have to stay tuned until they sort of
Launch.
announce it, what they're going to be doing. But these are just a couple of examples. There are other sites that you might where you might find information as well.
Yeah. We do use a group purchasing organisation. So the healthcare sector has 2 group purchasing organisations in Canada that do national contracts. The COPA group of hospitals use HealthPro, and they will have opportunities for national contracts for primarily medical and pharmaceutical contracts. The other one is MedBuy, and that covers national contracts as well. And there's also a GPO called St. Joseph's Health System. They primarily, they do only focus on capital equipment. And there's the link to their site as well. And both Peterborough and the COPA hospitals use that group purchasing organisation. The HSCN website is the Healthcare Supply Chain Network, and that's where you can access the templates that a lot of hospitals have adopted for RFPs and form of agreements. And I believe there was supplier training on those templates when they were first launched.
There was, and COPA's templates are based on those HSCN templates. We've modified them to make them better, but they are based on them.
That's the last one. Any questions? Yes?
One quick question here. I was just on the Bidding Go website, and you can see the bids, it's $250 a year. So you have to register to the site to look at the...
Yes, I think they do allow you a free trial period. So I would advise you to contact them and ask for a free trial. I know they do offer like free trial periods to do that. I was going to put a screenshot of COPA and Peterborough's open opportunities, but I don't think we actually have any open right now. But that could change, obviously, in a very short space of time.
I just figured since it's like supposed to be open for anybody, that it would be a free forum to take a look and see what's open for bidding.
So typically you can see what's open for bid and get the high level details of it. You just can't download the bid to respond. So I just check again to see. Mercs is the same. You have to pay an annual subscription fee to be able to download the bids. And both of them, I think, offer you the opportunity to download one at a time for a fee that's less than $250. Right. But for sure, you should be able to at least see what the bid is for, even if you can't download it to respond to it.
Just seems a little restricting for smaller businesses. Considering it's supposed to be like open bidding for...
Well, I guess the flip side of that is everybody has to pay the $250. So it is the way they operate. That's how they stay in business. So I understand what you're saying, but we have no way to issue a bid to someone who would like to respond without going through the public tendering site, if that's where we're posted, where it's posted. We're actually prohibited from giving it to you directly, and back to what I said before, because everyone has to pay to participate. So that's how they make that a level playing field.
You would think with all the government tenders and bid that's out there that's tax dollars are paying for it, they would be free available on a particular website where you can see them all across the board for everything and everywhere.
For these government contracts.
They post the services all over across from one site, and you think you do the same for the other.
So understand your point, but
Yeah.
I have a related question. I've stumbled across this barrier several times and had exactly the same question. I'm curious about the logic, you guys are professional purchasers. What is the logic that precludes you, or why would you be prohibited from distributing the documents directly to someone who didn't want to go through that channel? It seems to me that the need to go through the channel was presented in the first place as getting a wider audience, and you couldn't respond to all those requests. But if someone wants documents, why can't they get them? And I have a specific example. There's a construction association in town to which the construction, PCA, Peterborough Construction Association, they have 120 members, all of whom would like to bid work. Let's say you wanted something painted. They're not able to get those documents unless they go through Bid and Go or Merck's directly from you. And it doesn't make any sense to me. So could you explain to me why that's true?
Well, we use it to manage that process. It's the most efficient way that we can manage the inquiries and that process of communicating that information and dealing with those documents going both ways.
but it's actually it's more restrictive than that, because the requirement that it comes from the Agreement on Internal Trade and therefore is in the Procurement Directive is that when the value is over $100,000, as you said, it does have to be made publicly available to reach as wide an audience as possible. I guess the logic behind it is then that, what I said earlier, that if that's where it's posted and that's what the government has deemed to be the appropriate means of communicating an RFP, then in order for it to be fair to everyone, then everyone has to pay the annual subscription fee. Now, the $250, and again, I think there is a provision to just download a one-off for a lower fee, but the $250 does make it available, or provide you availability throughout the year to an infinite number of RFPs that might be posted that you're interested in. So we have no control over that, and we've tested the logic up the ladder too, but it's just sort of one of those, it is what it is. And because we must post publicly, that's the only way we can do it.
It might be, and this is just a suggestion, something that the Chamber could offer as a service. Just throwing it out there. Pay the one fee, I mean, instead of, I don't know how many members you have, but 250 instead of multiple. So I think this gentleman had a question, he's had his hand up for a while.
Sorry, two-part question. So when we're in an RFP presentation, so typically top 3 organizations are taken, and this is for financial services. We've seen a variance in when the presentations are being done that your RFP is presented, it's given to the organization, but pricing is put into a separate envelope, so you have 2 separate envelopes.
Correct.
So it's that information, then your oral presentation, and pricing is done third. So it's reviewed after the first 2 segments are done. We're seeing a variance where we're sitting in the presentations and the pricing sheets are right in front of the individuals, and we're being questioned on the pricing at that particular time. Will we see a shift where, because there's differences that we're seeing in these types of markets, so will it be coming out down the road saying that this will be a format that we are going towards, or is it based on each organization and how they've written the RFP and how they're viewing it?
That is organizationally dependent. The order of events, and it's recommended that pricing always come last, so it doesn't bias a decision, but it's not a requirement that it come last. And so different organizations can follow their own guidelines in terms of how they, what order they do things in. I can't say whether down the road that will become more restrictive or not, because that's not something that I've actually heard discussed
Right.
as a potential additional requirement.
Second part question is in the mush sector that we're starting to see signing bonuses are added, so they're falling underneath the added value services. So financial organizations are providing what they're deeming as a retention bonus if one of their clients have gone into an RFP for day-to-day banking services, or another financial institution is providing some type of compensation outside of the transition cost. They're putting more monetary funds in as almost a lure to bring them over. So I have a couple, ethically can that be done, and can that individual or that organization, if another financial institution finds out about it, can they be disqualified because it's something that really truly isn't an added value service? Or can that just be how interpretation is provided and they can put the information in there? Added value services typically are maybe group banking services or leasing programs, something that is more valuable to the organization rather than a monetary compensation. So like we've seen this in a different market, it's something that's new, so I'm still trying to get my head wrapped around it, but from an ethical, well, just even from an RFP standpoint, can someone be disqualified for doing that?
So it would be really difficult to answer the question without knowing the specifics of the particular RFP, just to give a sort of a general answer. The way RFPs are typically set up is with, as Tracy said, with the, pardon me, the financial and non-financial criteria to be evaluated. In the Procurement Directive Guidebook, there is a whole section on value-added incentives. And it is not, it's in the guidebook, so it's something actually we didn't reference on here that we should have. You can also, that, and let me just look and see, there should be, it'll be old, but it will redirect you.
I think in the...
Yes, there is, there's an email address in here. There is an email address in here that you could go to, but I was just looking to see if the web site is here for this. Apologies, we should have put that in the presentation. So if you Google BPS supply chain, BPS procurement directive, you will get to the Ministry of Government Services website where it's now hosted. Okay. And there is an implementation guidebook, and in that guidebook there's a whole section on value-added incentives, which talks about the principles that organizations should follow when they are looking at things that are outside the normal realm of the evaluation criteria. So I suggest that you go and look at that, and that your question would probably be better directed to the email address that's in here in terms of how that's managed in your sector.
I can say that in that guidebook, things like cash and signing bonuses are considered cash, are not allowed to be considered as value add. So, and that's the policy or the best practice guideline that we adopt at COPA.
And cash also means the gift cards.
Correct.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know that.
Any monetary value, yeah.
You might have covered this, I'm sorry, you've given us a lot of information, but I'm wondering how you become one of the three that are invited to bid.
So if that's less than $100,000 and it's an invitational RFP, so that is around knowing your market. So knowing who to contact, so at the hospital, for example, and we have representatives from the sourcing department there, who to contact around your goods and services. And at COPA, you can contact us through our website, and the particular specialist who's responsible for the portfolio that your goods and services would fall under retains records on suppliers, but it's really building that relationship with those people within those organizations. So we haven't quite We haven't yet got a specific mailbox. We want to set up a mailbox for supplier inquiries so we can manage that better rather than you calling COPA and not knowing who to ask for, so we can respond and retain your information on file. But it is around maintaining that relationship with the organisation that you want to do business with now and in the future.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Is there a list of capital and or normal consumable items that the association buys every year, so someone can look and say, I'd like to be aware of that tender when it comes up?
No, we don't publish anything on our website. We do, on the Bid and Go sites, there are all previous proposals, so there's a history there of everything that we've gone out in the past, and obviously what's current and what's open.
And the awards would tell you the maximum length of time that something could be awarded for, because we have to, if it was a public tender, we have to post that award. So if it was a 5-year base term with a 2-year extension, we would have to post that and say that's how we had awarded the business. I know that there are some organizations that do publish their list of upcoming RFPs, if you will. Great question and something we can consider. I think the Ontario Association for the OICCAC does that. So we'll think about that.
Yeah.
Obviously, the more bidders you have, the lower your price is likely to be, so it's not without payback to go to the work.
Right.
I can tell you the city at one time produced an entire list of the previous year's capital, actually 2 years. And several times we were able to access that list through the Construction Association and get them better pricing by making other people aware of opportunities that were out there.
Right.
But they hadn't previously seen because they just weren't in the loop. So if you're able to look at an entire year's purchases and say, there's an item we're interested in, it would be useful.
Sure, and we have the information, because Tracy has a spreadsheet of all the upcoming strategic sourcing initiatives that would cover most of this wall. So we do have the information.
That's good, we'll take that back.
Okay, well, I'm conscious of everybody's time. There's no more questions. I didn't see any other lingering ones.
Well, it's going to wrap up as
Yeah. No, I can actually ask it. Well, Ken, I just wanted to say a quick, on behalf of the Chamber, thanks everybody for your time today. Thank you for your time, and a quick thank you on behalf of the Chamber as well to both Sarah and Tracy for your presentations, and to recognize our sponsor, Val, without whom we'd be able to put on these monthly seminars. And Ken, I'd like to invite you up as well. Thanks very much.